Also with us, the president and CEO of the NAACP, Derek Johnson, and the co-founder and CEO of All In Together, Lauren Leader. It's good to have all of you on board this hour. So, Michael, let's start with your piece and the three big lessons. And I want to ask what those lessons are, but are those lessons applicable to the environment that we are going to be in the weeks and months ahead?
Well, I think they are. I think the Democrats have to make them applicable because these are the questions that I think they need to ask. Look, I say in the piece, Mika, you know, this isn't 1989 all over again. They haven't had three candidates lose landslides in a row. They lost one election by 1.5 points. Nevertheless, they lost. That's not winning. So they do have to ask some questions. My three prescriptive points have to do with the economy, with the way they deal with cultural politics at presidential election time, and third, with the way their brand has been, quite frankly, destroyed in large swaths of the country where they used to be able to get votes and elect senators and can't anymore. So those are the main points.
You also have really interesting analysis on the ad that a lot of people really hurt Kamala Harris's chances in this past election. And it was the ad where she's answering the question about transgender surgeries. Can you tell us about this was a conversation she had with a reporter back in 2019. Can you give us larger context of that conversation and what you found out?
Sure. Not a reporter, a leader of an important transgender organization. Her name was Mara Kiesling. In 2019, she interviewed all of the major Democratic contenders. You'll remember there were quite a lot of them at the time. And that's the interview. It's about a 6-minute interview. It's not that long, from which the Trump campaign picked that clip that showed Harris saying, you know, she did what she did for the sake of the movement and the agenda and so on. I interviewed Mara about this in December. I found her to be very forthright and absolutely correct. I think she chafed a little bit at the perception that she may have goaded Harris into saying those things that she said about getting the state of California to change its policy on gender-affirming surgery for transgender patients or prisoners. She didn't do that at all. I watched the video. Anybody can watch the video. The only question Mara Kiesling asked is, why should transgender people vote for you? And Harris went on this whole long thing. So that's one interesting thing that she said. Another interesting thing that she said to me is that she really does think that progressive groups, not just LGBTQ groups, but all sorts of progressive groups, need to change the way they think about how they do politics at presidential election time. That it's probably not the best idea to try to pin people down to a bunch of litmus test positions that can potentially be used against them in a general election campaign, as indeed some of Harris's 2019 primary era positions were. So she had a lot of interesting things to say that I think are worth listening to.
Lauren Leader, I just want to get you to chime in on this as Democrats move forward, because there's so many challenges now for communities that are feeling the heat. DEI being wiped clean from many agencies and even companies. How should Democrats, do you agree with Michael that this maybe it's for another day, or how do you manage through these issues?
You know, I think one of the lessons, which I was going to ask Michael about, that we took away from this election, when you think about the Senate races, I mean, you referenced, Michael, the Senate races, but what we saw was a huge gap between voters who, voted for Democratic senators in Michigan, for instance, and elsewhere, and then didn't vote for Kamala Harris. And I think there's some very interesting lessons there potentially for why some of those Democrats, especially in the Rust Belt states, broke through, won their races, even as the national candidate didn't. So what do you take away from that? I'm not sure they were, they did some dramatically different strategy in terms of dealing with social issues. They certainly talked about abortion rights. They talked about, sort of an inclusive view of America. But somehow Kamala got tarred with those social issues in a very different way than the Senate candidates did.
She did. A lot of it did have to do with that ad. And look, I want to be clear here. Transgender people are under assault right now in the United States. Undocumented people are under assault right now in the United States. These groups do really important work most of the time, and they should be supported, and Democrats should support the work they do. It's just this one thing I'm talking about at presidential election time. With respect to Kamala, I think it was just that she wasn't as well known, and she was only the candidate for 107 days, and she didn't have a chance to make a full picture of herself in the way that some of these Senate candidates did, and they were known in their states, and Harris wasn't.
So, Derek Johnson, NAACP celebrating 116 years. The campaign moving forward is Keep Advancing. Can you talk about that, especially given the backdrop that is happening right now?
Well, we were created in 1909, and our primary goal was to make democracy work. And going to the last conversation, if you think about Angela Alsabrook, if you think about Lisa Blunt Rochester, they had state races and they talked to their voters. The Kamala Harris campaign, 107 days, they tried to have a national campaign that was not rooted in local communities. So that's why you've seen the gap between the turnout and the outcome for those races compared to the presidential race. The business model of campaigning for the Democratic Party is broken. It has been broken for a while. We've seen it in 2016. We had a lightning rod of a first Trump administration that turned out voters in 2020, and then it went back to the same model in 2016, and we got the same outcome. So the party needs to really look at the business model of how they do campaigns for the national candidates and focus more locally to talk to voters where they live.
So, Derek, let's talk about this moment right now. You know, we're not at a campaign season just yet. It does seem that I've spoken to some Democrats who feel sort of frustrated that their party hasn't really coalesced around a message or found a leading voice or two. And it's also striking sort of the lack of protest, let's say, this time around, as opposed to what we saw 8 years ago when Donald Trump was first inaugurated. What do you make of that? How should the party be adapting to this moment, this first few weeks of the Trump administration, as he's unleashed this blitz of proposals and cuts?
Well, we are, 24 days since the election. Naomi Klein's book, Shock Doctrine, really lays out the strategy of throwing so many things on the board that it almost paralyzed the opposition. And then you go to the real focus of the budget and the tax cuts. So much of what we've seen are the distractions or how to distort. It paralyzed the opposition so they can run a play of really stealing the wealth of Americans in front of their eyes.
I do think, Michael, that as we talk about the back and forth for Democrats as they try to rebuild in this moment, I take your point that you're saying maybe don't tinker with the economic message that much. It was only a 1.5-point loss. But it's the idea of brand, which feels so intangible to me. Yeah. How do you fix the cultural affiliation and affinity that Republican voters now feel with Trump himself? Because I think Lauren is right to point out the dissonance between how Trump himself did and then how the MAGA-endorsed candidates did further down ballot. Yeah. But for Democrats, how do you fix an intangible like brand?
Yeah, it's like
a vibe.
Yeah, that's a central question to this whole thing, and there are limitations on what the Democrats can do. You know, they're cultural issues that appeal to working class people. There's only so far Democrats can and should go. You know, they shouldn't give up their support for the rights for transgender people. They shouldn't, change their position on abortion rights. They can talk in a way that reaches working class, regular people a little bit more. As their base has become more college educated, they're like talking college people to college people. You know, that's just one simple thing. Just change your language a little bit. Talk to people who don't have college degrees. I have a little section in the piece. You know, the Democrats talk a lot about college loans, college debt is a real issue. But I always wonder, what does the HVAC specialist think when he hears Democrats carry on about that? It's not about him. So talk to him, too. There are things that they can do that doesn't require bending their positions on other issues.
The New Republic's March issue is available now. Editor Michael Toki, thank you very much. President and CEO of the NAACP, Derek Johnson, great to have you on this morning. We appreciate it. Lauren, stay with us if you can.